Welcome to the Hearth Matters podcast with me, Catherine Lucas Damer, and my lovely co host, Erin Zuma. Today we are speaking with a living legend, someone you may not have heard of if you live in the U.S., but Patrick Holden is the father of the organic and sustainable food movement in the U.K. He is the founder and CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust, which works internationally to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food and farming systems. Under his tenure there and during his time as director of the Soil Association, sales of organic produce in Britain went from £50 million to £2 billion. And for American listeners, I'm referring to currency, not tonnage. And he walks the talk. His regenerative family-owned dairy in Wales, the Holden Farm Dairy, recently celebrated 50 years. And what's important to know is that Patrick did not inherit his farm. He is a first-generation dairyman and farmer who built his farm and his soil literally from the ground up with his family and with his community. I met Patrick last year at an event where my husband was speaking, and we were immediately kindred. Patrick and I have witnessed 2 to 3 waves now of young people embracing the organic farming movement, and each wave bringing something new to the mix. And we're both watching now as this youngest generation infuses their flavor into the movement, new insights and techniques and more technology and more data. And none of this would be possible without the trailblazers who came before them, like Patrick and others. Farming is a controversial subject at the moment. If you're paying attention to the news, farmers are protesting all over Europe, Canada, and even the U.S. They're fighting heavy-handed regulations that in many cases don't provide the assistance they need to make the transition to healthier farming practices. The truth is, food is not controversial. We all want the same thing. Every human on the planet wants good, clean, fair food, and we want it for a good price. Patrick and I are kindred because we spent our lives providing food for people in one form or another. And now, as we find ourselves aging, we're both turning our attention to ensuring the movement continues to grow so that the generations coming up behind us have access to good, clean, fair food. And that means supporting our young people with resources, knowledge, education, and when we can, wisdom. For many of us in the food space, Patrick is a real-life hero, and speaking to him today was truly an honor. Enjoy. Thanks again, Patrick, for doing this. I'm just thrilled to be talking to you.
Well, I kind of think that things happen for a reason, and so we met each other up in Yorkshire last year,
Right.
and it feels good that we've connected.
It does, and it was interesting because, Bruce, my husband, was talking to Rupert Sheldrake, and they were deep into some sort of, you know, biology, origin of life, science question, and you and I think, sort of found each other and started talking about Broughton Hall, where we were, and the, sustainability issues around sheep and farming there, and it was really an interesting conversation.
I don't want to denigrate the conversation that Bruce and Rupert were having because they are both living, inspired. I would call them geniuses
Yes.
or genii or whatever the collective term is. And actually, interestingly, Merlin, Rupert's son, just presented to one of our select committees in our parliament. And I just was watching him earlier today. What an amazing man he is as well, talking about fungi.
Yes.
So there was a lot of extraordinary knowledge happening there. So our more farm related conversation was perhaps at a lower level, but it was special to me.
Yeah, me too, and, the guys were talking about, some big ideas that are important to be discussing, and Merlin bridges our worlds because he's talking about big ideas, but also the importance of, mycelial networks within soil, and you as the director of the Soil Association in the UK, I'm sure that's a very or you were anyway for a number of years, that's a very special, subject near and dear to your heart. But before we get into that, let's start talking about your farm and dairy in Wales, the Holden Farm Dairy. You recently celebrated 50 years, right?
Yes, we did. We arrived at the farm in June 1973 as a back to the land community farm, wanting to, actually inspired by uh, a number of experiences I had in California, in the Bay Area, the a couple of years before that, when I had a lot of very interesting experiences. And as a result of which it became clear to me and our fellow communards that the right thing to do was to get back to the land, live in harmony with nature, be self-sufficient, and avoid the what we thought was the imminent breakdown of society. So
Right.
that really was that was the seeds of what took us to West Wales. And 50 years later, we still farm. And I'll just try to describe the farm to you. We're on a hill. We're about 10 miles in from the west coast of Wales, and the weather is very different from California. It rains a lot. Although we can get amazing high pressure when it is the most beautiful place on the planet, possibly apart from Big Sur. It's a discussion. And we have 300 acres now. We started with 135 and we're now farming 300, half of which is rented and the other half we own. Well, we own in partnership with a bank, an ethical bank. And we have a dairy herd of around 90 milking cows and their progeny, because we rear all our replacement heifers on the farm. And the original cows actually go right back to 1973 when we bought the foundation
Oh,
herd.
interesting.
And we're turning about 80% of the milk that they produce into a single farm raw milk cheddar style cheese called Havod. That's pronounced V, but spelled F. So it's HAFOD. And along the road, we have also grown wheat and milled it into wholemeal flour to sell at the local Whole Food shop, which is in Aberystwyth. But also for many years, 26 years, we grew carrots and we used to sell them in London and then to supermarkets. And we had to stop doing that. But that's another part of the story. But what is an amazing thing to celebrate is the experience of having stewardship over a landscape for a long period of time and observing uh, the consequences of your actions. And so, for the whole time, we've been farming without any chemicals. So we've used not a single kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer or any pesticides. We're now trying to minimize our use of imported everything, ranging from animal feeds to seeds to straw, fertilizers, obviously. So it's a kind of circular economy project. We don't aim to be completely self-sufficient, but we'd like to try to be as resilient and circular as we can. And so I guess what we're trying to do now is to see how much food we can produce from this 300-acre hill, whilst at the same time looking after nature, building soil, and hopefully building a strong cultural cohesion and having a positive impact on the community around us. So that's the project.
Your soil must be amazing.
Well, that's such an interesting question. And I think it is amazing. And it certainly, we've been measuring carbon rather sporadically over the years. I wish that we had realized right at the beginning that it would have been so good to measure the soil carbon and everything else and the biodiversity and get some baseline data. And then we could compare where we are today with when we started. But we didn't do that because we didn't realize the importance of doing that at the time. But we are now trying to collect data. And certainly the most recent soil samples that we've gathered look as though the grassland management that we practice is not only building the organic matter of the soils under our stewardship, but it's also building soil. So our total carbon stocks seem to be going up. And that is important because the ruminant animals that we have on our farm, the Ayrshire cows, have had a lot of bad press recently because they're supposed to be methane emitters, which obviously they are, although the FAO published a report in 2008 called Livestock's Long Shadow, which suggested that grazing animals, ruminants, were terrible in terms of climate change. But we are now more and more convinced that if you practice holistic grazing and you look after the soil in the right way, the soil carbon gain can more than offset the methane emissions of the animals. So we may even be, as a farm, net negative. In other words, part of the solution in terms of climate change, even though the whole farm economy revolves around cows.
So you're doing are you doing like the regenerative savanna style farming like Joel Salatin is at Polyface Farms? Are you like do chickens follow your cows, and pick out the, larvae that could potentially harm the cows next year's crop? And are you doing that whole sort of savanna style regenerative farming, or what is your strategy there?
Well, I have visited Polyface
Oh,
Farm.
have you?
Yes, and I was very, very inspired by seeing what Joel has achieved there. And I think we're kind of following in his slipstream, to use an inappropriate aeronautical analogy. And we are not, funnily enough, we just bought 10 point of lay pullets. Do you use that word in the US?
Yeah,
Pullets, meaning
yeah, we
young
do.
laying hens. So we just literally brought them back to the farm last night. That's just for the household. And we aspire to do proper mixed grazing and have poultry following the cows. But what we are doing is holistic grazing, inspired by Joel, but also Alan Savory and others,
Right.
mob grazing. But I think the mob grazing we are doing with our cows is slightly different from what Joel does, because if you are rearing beef cattle, you can allow the grass to get quite tall because beef cattle don't have such a high protein requirement as milking cattle. So we do practice rotational grazing, and our grazing rotation period might be anything from 30 to 60 days, depending on the time of year. And we are trying to make it shorter so that in an ideal world, the cows would never graze one of their paddocks for more than, say, 48 hours.
Mm.
But doing that has required us to invest a lot in tracks and fencing and water, as anybody who's practicing mob grazing will know. And I think we're just in the, we can get a lot better at it. And what is really interesting for me to reflect upon is that after 50 years on the farm, I feel as if in some ways we're just at the beginning of what we could achieve. And it's so brilliant that there's this network of regenerative farmers all over the world who are, we're feeding each other with our ideas derived from practice. And Joel is definitely one of those.
Mhm, mhm. Well, it's sort of an aside, are you able to sell raw milk in the UK to consumers?
Yes, we are, but
Mm.
it's the, the short answer to the question is in the England and Wales you can, but you can only sell it directly through a retail outlet, either your own or if you have like a franchise thing with a milk dispenser, which is in somebody else's shop. What you can't do is sell to a retailer who then sells it as raw. So either you can sell it directly from the farm or to a local shop if you have like one of these. I don't know if you have them in the US, these milk dispenser things, which are more and more raw milk producers are using them now because they're a very good way of selling milk and getting it to people who want it. And there are more and more people who do want it. But the longer answer to your question, and by inference, I can say that in Scotland, you're not allowed to do that, which is
Mm.
because the Food Standards Agency is even more paranoid in Scotland than they are in England and Wales.
Mm,
And
mm.
I think it would be maybe another part of this conversation would be that we live in an age where there seems to be some sort of congenital fear of bacteria, which is so interesting. And we sterilize everything. And Michael Pollan has written so movingly about this in his book Cooked, about cheesemakers, and we are cheesemakers. And if you are in our milking parlor obviously it's a bacterial soup in there because there's poo from the cows and it's just generally a sort of open place. But then when you go into the cheese making, the cheese room, immediately you have to have more or less a complete change of mentality, and you have to put on a blue hairnet, and you have to, wash and sterilize yourself, and all this because, well, I would say in part, I mean, this is a discussion, obviously, but the hygiene police have infected us all with a fear of bacteria. And I think that if we win the war against bacteria, we sterilize everything, we will be on the losing side. And every small artisan food producer, whether they're a cheesemaker or perhaps they have a meat operation where they kill animals in a local abattoir and then they sell meat directly, will live in fear of the visit from the environmental health officer, the EHO, who can easily close you down overnight if they find the wrong kind of bacteria. And I do believe that that has to change. Our attitude towards bacteria has to change. And of course, it would be ludicrous to say that there is no risk from E. coli and E. coli 0157 and other pathogenic strains of bacteria. But it's so important to understand that bacteria are in us and part of us, and the microbiome and everything. We have to find a way to have a different attitude towards food hygiene. And that's a long conversation. Sorry, that was a bit of I got caught up with talking about that because it's so relevant to our lives on a daily basis, this issue.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I did a 10-minute talk on TEDx about bacteria and how we should all be making our own heirloom ferments in our kitchens because, there's something like 200,000 species of bacteria just in the dust bunnies in your kitchen. So when you make kraut, or I make kefir every morning with raw milk, because luckily raw milk is legal in California. I ferment all kinds of things. And, I was a sort of an early to market fermenter with my company, Farmhouse Culture. And so I know exactly what you're talking about. It's an important issue, but dairy is, boy, it's so regulated. Who's the guy here in California? His name's is it Mark McAfee or something like that? Do you know the guy I'm talking about? He's a real raw
No.
milk advocate in the United States. And oh gosh, his stories, and also I want to say that this kind of brings us back to this idea of maybe the more local, our dairies are, the safer this is. Because now we're relying on like the transparency because dairies have to be clean. So if you go to the dairy to pick up your milk or you trust people who are getting the dairy from that shop. Now, everybody's going to find out if your dairy is not clean and you make one person sick
Exactly.
and you lose your business. One person, it's done. You're done. That huge investment. So I think a lot of people don't realize that dairy farmers are extremely cognizant of the balance in the good bacteria and the bad bacteria. And I keep thinking of that nun in Michael Pollan's book, right?
Sister Noella.
Yes, with her wood vat and the health department wanted her to get rid of it. And she was able to prove that there was a less I think they injected the milk with E. coli, right? In the story.
Yeah.
And her wood vat cheese, the bacteria in that killed the E. coli. Where in the stainless steel vat cheese, it didn't. I think she was also using raw milk versus pasteurized milk. So it was all these different variables. I could have it a little bit wrong, but it's really
No,
about
you've got it right.
it's
You've
really
got it
about
right.
that balance, isn't it?
It is, and it's complicated, as you say, because obviously you're right that if you're a dairy farmer, attention to the cleanliness of the way you milk is critical, especially if you're making a raw milk cheese. And, every day the cheese is a reflection in part of your hygiene or lack of hygiene of your milking practice. And of course, downstream from that, in the cheese making operation itself, you need cleanliness. But as the story you just told with Sister Noella demonstrates, if in the wooden paddle of her cheese vat, there was a mixture of bacteria, and even if there'd been some E. coli amongst them, the friendly bacteria, through competitive advantage, I think it's called, overwhelm the bad bacteria. So this is where it gets really complex, isn't it? Because if you have an attitude that the only safe space for making cheese is zero bacteria, then if you do get some pathogens that come in, then they cannot be overwhelmed by friendly bacteria. And yet that's the attitude that we have. So it's really a subtle thing. But I think your other point you're making is that local food systems have their own defense against risk of illness. Is so important because it's obvious that as long as there are people eating food and people making cheese or whatever they make, there will be breakdowns occasionally where people will get sick. But actually, if you have a localized food system, the risk is proportionately much less. And as you say, there's a self-regulating thing there, which is that if your customers don't, if the food that you sell to your customers doesn't agree with them, they're going to stop buying it from you.
Mhm.
Whereas if you have a centralized food system with literally millions of people being dependent on food from one particular source, then if something does go wrong, then the consequences are devastating, which is in a why we've had to develop this attitude towards sterilizing all our food, which is in turn making the public sick. So we really have to rethink this. And I think the forum that we need to create to have this conversation needs to be very open and very listening, if you know what I mean, because this is a complex thing we're discussing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Uh, so going into the next step there, local food systems are neighbors allowed to sell products to each other in the UK? For instance, can you make 20 loaves of sourdough bread in your home and sell it to your neighbors legally?
I think yes, but only, only barely. So as soon as you get into any sort of proper selling system, you're sooner or later, the EHOs will come and inspect your premises. And unless it gets passes the test, they could say, well, you can't do that. I mean, I think sourdough bread, you're probably on the right side, but if you get into anything livestock related, it gets much more draconian. And so, for instance, if we could take an animal, which we just have done, we took 3 pigs to the local abattoir, which is 6 miles from our farm. Lucky us. And the abattoir slaughtered the pigs, but also processed them. And we had the sausages back, and they did that processing, which means that we can sell the sausages. But because they're in a package, but if we had taken the carcass of the pig back and processed it ourselves, which we could do because we've got the equipment, we would only be allowed to consume that pork as a family. Although I guess it would be probably just about barely legal to barter it, although I'm not even sure that's true. So you'll get into this sort of gray areas where if you're really clever, and that's what Joel Salatin does, doesn't he? He said you're not allowed to put the dead chicken that's been slaughtered in his open air slaughterhouse into a bag. So he gets the customer to put it in the bag and then it's legal. Well, I think it's the same sort of thing with us. And if you are supplying supermarkets, then you have to have another level of audit, which is even more draconian and costs a lot of money. And I would say that the the spread of small scale local food systems is being massively, massively held back by this ridiculous overregulation, which leads to the fear of being closed down, enormous, unfair, disproportionate costs. And unless we change that, we are not going to be able to change our highly centralized and industrialized food
Yeah,
systems.
here in California, we in 2012, I was fairly active in promoting this, even though I had a natural food company. Cottage food laws that do allow you to make food at home and sell to your neighbors, but it's so restricted. It's basically bread and pastry and jam. Now, there are other states,
It's
and
the same.
is it? There are other states
Yeah,
here.
that's the same.
We have food freedom states, which are really interesting. Like in the most environmentally focused states, we have the heaviest regulations. But in the states where more conservatives are, they have what they call food freedom acts, So it's pretty much you can do whatever you want with your neighbors, but if you screw up, we're gonna slap you pretty hard on your hands. But, so really you can, like, make beef jerky and yogurt and sauerkraut and all kinds of things and sell if you're in Wyoming or Texas or Florida, but not in California. And then
So that's really interesting, isn't it? How, it's kind of an unexpected turn of things, isn't it? That the most democratic states, with the most, quote, civilized societies, have the most fear of, you know, bad food hygiene. That's quite weird, really. And it probably deserves a conversation of its in its own
yeah,
right.
and
But
it's
maybe,
overregulation, right? I think the sort of the more liberal states here have a tendency to highly regulate everything.
yeah,
We're sort of these
yeah.
nanny states. Vermont is another one, really intense regulations for everything, and yet it's probably one of the most liberal states. It's an interesting turn of events that you're right, probably merits a conversation. But there are a lot of people in our, area who are, working on solutions to sort of circumvent regulations, and I probably shouldn't be saying that on podcasts, but, we have something here called, like, cow shares. Do you have that there where, where
Yeah, we have variations. People are getting really ingenious and
Yeah,
imaginative
right.
in working their work. It's like what Joel's book is called, Everything I Want to Do is Illegal.
Mhm.
And and it's dangerous to even tell that's as we are discussing now, because who knows? The food hygiene police might be watching.
Right, right.
But I think, I just think we have to challenge these orthodoxies. And it's not as if we're wanting to challenge them for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is, have you heard of a guy, Chris Van Tulleken?
No.
He just wrote a book called Ultra Processed People.
Oh,
And he is a doctor from a
okay.
London hospital, young guy, probably only in his early 30s, brilliant communicator. He's just really put it out there that ultra processed food, which he defines in the book, is arguably killing people. I mean, it's certainly responsible directly and indirectly for the emergence of a whole range of previously uncommon diseases, ranging from obesity and diabetes to, cancers, food intolerances, diseases of the immune system. And this guy brilliantly is calling it out. And he's getting a lot of traction. And then there's another guy called Professor Tim Spector, who's also looking at the microbiome and the effect of ultra processed foods and just badly produced foods on the microbiome and on public health. And I think these people are really starting to change the public debate about what good food really is. Thank God, because, I mean, obviously my whole working life has been, as it were, before the farm gate, or mainly before the farm gate, not exclusively. But meanwhile, horrors are being inflicted on uh, bad and good food after the farm gate, and it's making everyone sick. So we need all help we can get, and I think this new interest, which is emergent now, in what happens to the raw materials that come off farms, is really an exciting development.
Yeah, w we take inspiration from 2nd and 3rd world countries that, where women and men work together in homes, to produce all kinds of goods and services for each other, and you look at those countries, they don't have the obesity issues and the depression and the autoimmune issues that we've got here, and it's not I don't mean to simplify all of the issues we've got going, but the UK and the United States, we have the highest obesity rates
Yeah,
in the
we're up
world.
there.
We are the 1 and 2.
Yeah, we're we're just behind you, but not far.
So
Do you know the healthiest people the most beautiful people I ever saw was in northern Kenya at a festival of nomadic pastoralists in a place near Lake Turkana, Kalacha. And I went there in 2013, and it was a tribal dance festival. And there were 26 tribes there. And most of them, a lot of them, they go on these, nomadic episodes where they go up maybe for a couple of months before they come back to their village. And there was a guy there that I met from actually southern Ethiopia who was one of the pastoralists, and he spoke good English and had been in Italy for a while. And I asked him, what he ate. And he said, well, when we're away on these long journeys, we just have blood and milk. And I've never seen such beautiful, healthy looking people in all my life. And they were so full of vitality. Of course, they do have, I'm not saying they only eat off animal products, but they have plant products as well. But it was just, you could feel the vitality of them. And it just left a very, very deep impression on me that we've gone so far from where we need to be with our food systems that we need to get back to living in harmony with nature and eating food from our local ecosystem.
Yeah, yeah. You know, before we jump into sort of your bigger work around the environment and sustainability, can you talk about like a little bit more about your farm? How involved is your family and your wife? And this is an area that we're very interested in because we're interested in the domestic sphere, and the farm is really the place where people have worked together for I don't know, thousands of years. And before that, we worked together as hunter gatherers. This idea of separating public sphere and domestic sphere is relatively new in terms of human history. And you and your farm and your family, in many ways, embody sort of the cottage economy of the agrarian era. Interestingly, that the industrialization of a lot of these things, fabrics and food and everything, happened started in the UK. But can you talk about what is your life there with your family, and how involved are your kids, and what does your wife do, and yeah.
Well, we are a family farm. And interestingly enough, I got a great friend who is a Dane called Thomas Hartung, who was with us
I know
yesterday.
Thomas.
And he's a, you know,
I know
Thomas.
Thomas.
Of
I, spent time with Soren Elkerson. Do you know Soren, his partner on the farm in Denmark?
yes,
Yes, Soren is
yes,
a
I
good friend.
do.
And my
So
son
he was the co-founder
yeah,
of Ostler, which I can't pronounce, even though I was on his board for
yeah,
many years.
yeah. And my son actually wrote a book with Soren on fermentation. My son co-authored my book on fermentation. So we know Soren. And I
Okay,
went to one of the, MAD conferences, there.
I went to one of
Did
those.
you? What year, do you know?
Yeah.
2000 I think I was there
Oh,
2016 or 17.
I think it might have been earlier than that, the one I went to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
So that's really an interesting that's a fascinating connection. But I think what is interesting about Austen, if I've got that
yeah,
right, is that Thomas is a fantastic entrepreneur. And so the two of them, they developed this incredible s- national box scheme and meal solution company,
mm,
which is farm based, but it's got an interesting relationship with a centralized distribution model.
yes,
And he and I were talking yesterday, literally yesterday, about what we are doing on our farm. And I guess what we're doing is very different because we're we're farming on the basis that we are trying to add value to what are the raw materials that we produce and stacking, if you see what I mean. So and our imagination for the future of the farm is that we don't, although we're selling cheese, which actually does go all over the world, which is interesting. Our direction would be to try to make the food system more localized, and for the food that we produce, in our case, meat and milk at the moment, although we might go back into vegetables again, to retain its provenance and be sold with a story behind it to people who know the story and can identify the food from our particular farm. And I suppose that farm ecosystem has a social dimension to it as well. And in our case, it's myself, my wife Becky, who's really centrally involved with running the farm, not only milking the cows more than I do these days, but also doing most of the paperwork. And she's the heart of the farm, really. And without her, the farm would probably fall apart. And now uh, we've got four boys together, and two of them have just dropped out of university and come back to the farm. One is Harry is 19 and Ben is 22. And both of them are expressing quite a strong interest in coming back to the farm and staying with us. And a third son James, who's at an international sixth form college with students from all over the world. He said when he came back, because it's boarding college, and he came back the other day and he said, well, he calls me Paddy actually. He said, Paddy, he said, one thing that's strange about what's happened to me is that all the students at Atlantic College think it's really cool what I know about farming. And he's only 16 years old. But
Mhm.
he said, I never realized it would be of any interest to anyone else. He just took it for granted because he grew up on the farm. And so I think there's something going on here that a lot of young people are beginning to think differently about what a career would look like. And for me, that is so exciting that they can see that the quality of life on a family farm, and we're not just the family, we employ 5 people in the cheese dairy, and we want to become an educational platform as well. But I think this idea that the cultural life of a farm and the family life of the farm, and particularly the women who are kind of the center of the whole thing, can become a really interesting new model for a career. And this has all happened really, it's sort of happening as we speak, because Harry went to Cardiff University to study biology, and he dropped out after the first term. And he just said, he's bright and, he could have done well there, but he just said, it just doesn't do anything for me.
Yeah.
And then Thomas was saying to me yesterday, he said, well, you didn't go to university, and now 2 of your sons didn't go to university. And maybe that's an interesting new way in which young people are going to react against the system where they're learning stuff which is totally irrelevant to, making the planet a better place for future generations, which is what's happening, I think. I mean, we're trashing the planet, aren't we? And so young people need to find a new relationship with nature.
Yeah, and young people
Right.
can also, put together bespoke programs through the best online, courses in the world. You can learn about cell biology at Harvard if you want. You can learn about psychology at Stanford. It's all available online. So why not create your own farming curriculum? Instead of going to a university and putting up with some of that. I mean, university certainly has its advantages in that it's a great way to meet a potential spouse and community and network for the future. So that's probably a different conversation. Erin has been really quiet throughout. When we talked about doing this interview, I said, Patrick and I might get going, and I I give you a pass if you want to step out because we're a couple of elders. We've been around this business, well, around this world for many, many years. And for me, literally for 60 years, because my grandparents were involved in this. My grandfather had a cattle ranch. My grandmother was an organic gardener and a macrobiotic. I mean, she solved some health issues with healthy eating. So I was raised I'm a very California
Wow.
girl in that way. And so I said, Erin, you get a pass if you don't want to come. She's, no, no, I really want to, I want to hear what you guys have to say. Erin, what do you think so far? Do you have any questions? And we haven't been letting you get a word in.
No, no, I love being a fly on the wall for this conversation because as Catherine said, I get to learn so much. And my question was going to be about sort of the family enterprise and how that operates. And Patrick, I think what you said is your son's experience as a 16-year-old, really hearing that what's more interesting than the curricula that they're consuming at college is what you're doing on the farm. We certainly have observed that here in the US. There is really such an interest in homesteading, and it's side by side with an interest in sort of gig work. And really, what I draw in terms of a theme is integrating work and pleasure or work and family life.
Yes.
Really, that is
Yes.
sort of in the ether. And so I wonder, a little bit more about the operations, but also have you seen in your customer base some interest from younger folks who are wanting to eat more healthily, really, really immerse themselves in what can often be big talk about, buy local, shop local, eat local. Like, have you seen more of an interest in your products because of the story, because of what you're doing on your farm?
Yes. I mean, it feels as if every day brings some sort of new revelation about this. It's like an unfolding flower, but the flower is just in microcosm, a reflection of a changing attitudinal ecosystem, which is happening all over the world. So just to give you one example, I came to Bristol, where I am now, from the farm this afternoon. And on the way, I had a call from someone who is supervising a master's course at Oxford University. And she said, I've got a student who is doing an MA, and she wants to come and stay on your farm this summer because she's really interested in ways in which farming systems which work in harmony with nature, including, pastoralism, but also farming, producing food in harmony with biodiversity, so that you, instead of saying, well, this is rewilding and this is intensive agriculture, we bring the two together, but also the cultural dimension, as you say. I mean, that's, a new person who literally I've come across this afternoon, who may want to come and live on our farm for 6 weeks if we can find a way to make it work in the summer. And she just wants to study what we're doing. And I think it's an incredibly exciting moment in the history of agriculture at the moment, because we really have got to the end of the road with, extractive and industrial farming. And I think more and more people who have no relationship with farms at all, even not hardly any contact, by one means or another, they're waking up to this. And it feels relevant to me that, when I came back from the Bay Area in 1971, I felt part of a movement of change, and you couldn't really say what it was that had brought this shift of consciousness about. It was kind of mycelial, something was going on, and you couldn't say what it was exactly. It was a kind of post-war thing out of the 50s and the 60s, and I felt part of it. And I feel there's something quite different, but in some way related, going on at the moment. And it's happening in America, it's happening in the UK, I think it's happening everywhere.
You and
Right.
I have watched, waves of young people come in, and so I think we're watching this new wave come in. And that's why it's so important that I think we speak up and talk about the history of the local food and sustainable food movement, so they understand that they've really got something solid to build on. Uh,
Exactly. Exactly. And by the way, I don't want to cut in, but
yeah.
just to say, you're right. We've watched waves. I mean, I would say it could even be like the second or the third generation of
Yes.
young people that have sort of come through since we started farming in the 70s.
Yeah.
But what's going on now is different. I can't explain it, but it's different.
I think do you think it's technology? I think they're bringing with them a whole different, like, they don't have to go to a library anymore to learn things. They whip out their phone. They can take a picture of the cow dung and see what's going on in it. Like, they've got so much. They're bringing that level of technology to this, and also I think they see how hard a lot of us have worked to try and make the food system better and healthier, and how many obstacles and challenges we've faced. And even though we've made tremendous progress, I think you and I would probably both agree that it hasn't been as much as we thought it would be. I thought we'd have fewer pesticides by this time. I thought there'd be fewer plastics in the environment. I thought things would be a little, maybe I was too idealistic. I thought things would be much better than they are. Again, I don't mean to negate the amazing progress that we've made. And I think these young people see it and they go, you know what? We're just going to circumvent the whole system. Like, we're tired of dealing with these outdated, organizations and governments that just, they're all in bed with corporations. Here in the United States, especially, our farm bill never gets better. Every 5 years it comes up, and it's just a rotation of, through the USDA and big ag companies. It's just a revolving door. It's, so I think a lot of young people are bringing technology and innovation, and new ways of thinking about how do we just, okay, forget them. Let's create our own systems. Let's let's
I think that's,
I think I,
I think that's right. But I think it, I mean, I don't disagree with what you've just said, but maybe it's slightly more mysterious than that as well, because, what creates a consciousness shift. You could, if you were a sociologist, you could say, well, it's this condition and that reaction and blah, blah, blah. Or you could say it's because technologies become available for a whole generation of young people to know much more and see much more than they ever could before. But I think there's something else. I don't know what it is. It's mysterious. It's maybe
Yeah,
it's planetary. It's cyclical, I
yeah.
think, and it's to do with consciousness. And it's maybe we can't even answer the question why it is that now this change is happening, but it's very powerful if it is happening in the way that we both sense it is.
Yeah.
That means that things could change much more quickly than we could even imagine.
Yes. That's what I'm
Right.
hoping. That's what I'm hoping.
Well, and there are young people who are listening to people like yourselves, you know, people who are looking around them and seeing more sickness, more anxiety, more depression, and asking
Yeah.
themselves why. We can look back at 20-year-olds in the 70s and the 60s, and right, we have now decades worth of video and footage of people, and we can compare ourselves, which, on the one hand is not, that isn't always the healthiest thing to do, but to take a look at, how we're faring physically and mentally, and to then see, oh, what's the difference? Well, we have these big food systems. We have, all of these substances and chemicals that we were born into, right? We've grown up with them. And so I think that's part of what is prompting the questions. Is this food that I'm eating good for me? Is the work or is the education that I'm receiving good for me? And what are my other options?
Well, yeah. And at this college I mentioned, Atlantic College, which is part of a global network called United World Colleges, where uh, James, my youngest, the 16-year-old, is attending. They've just introduced a new course. They study using a system called International Baccalaureate, which is a
Mm.
French kind of equivalent of A levels. So I don't know do you have any of that in the
Yes,
US?
it's
But
called
anyway,
the AP. Yep.
okay. So they've just introduced a new theme in it, which is called Systems Transformation Pathways,
Mhm.
which James is on, and it's like a third of the marks or something like that. And so that in itself is an indication that things are even changing in the education system, which is exciting.
Right.
It
Right.
certainly is. Erin is expecting her first child in a couple of months. And,
Wow,
yeah, and all of a sudden
that's congratulations.
and she's gotten all of a sudden, she's buying organic. There's something about,
Yes,
maybe I've influencing her too. And her husband certainly
certainly.
buys organic, but, yeah, I just love to watch her wake up. I'm twice her age and working in our nonprofit together. I'm learning so much, about what young people are thinking about food, and it is interesting and maybe a conversation for another time, but I think local, food, at least in California, has come to symbolize, "Oh, that's expensive." Only
Mhm.
rich people can afford that food, and a lot of us who got into the food business wanting to create healthier foods realized that only the top 5 or 2% of our communities could afford to buy our foods. And so, one of the things that we're looking at, Patrick, and you and I can talk maybe about this offline, is building these neighbor to neighbor networks where we reduce the middlemen and we make and sell products in our homes. And some of my calculations are is like that you can make 40 or $50,000 a year with a, say, a home bakery or a home based restaurant, which is now legal in California. So I do feel like that's the next place we need to drive this conversation, because if you've got small organic companies like yours and like mine, the regulations kill us, all the middlemen, all of just all this, and this is a question I wanna ask you that I'm getting to here. Do you have an equivalent of the farm bill in the UK that mandates, like,
Okay,
what
so
subsidies and things like that?
I just want to, before I answer that, which I will, I think one of the reasons why it's been so very difficult for small scale regenerative organic farming to avoid the critique that it's just expensive food for privileged people who can afford it. It's because we live in a dishonest economic climate where the polluter doesn't pay, and farmers who are delivering on climate or nature or delivering social benefits are not rewarded for them.
Yeah.
So we hosted a conference in San Francisco in 2016 called The True Cost of American Food,
Mm.
which a lot of people came to. And we, in the run up to that conference, we produced a report called The Hidden Costs of UK Food. And a dear friend of mine, Richard Young, was the author of the report. And the headline conclusion was that if you buy $1's worth of food in a US supermarket or £1's worth of food in a UK supermarket, that represents only half its true cost. The true cost is at least twice that, maybe 3 times that, if you factor in the damage to climate, the destruction of natural capital, and particularly the damage to public health. And so because the pricing system of the food we buy has been essentially dishonest, not representing the true cost of the food, we've encountered this massive opposition who say our food is expensive and niche and only for well-off people who can afford it. Normal people can't afford that price of the food, when in fact it's so unfair that has happened, and that organic food has got a reputation as being expensive, and in fact it's not expensive, it's honestly priced, whereas the industrial food is dishonestly priced. So one of the responses to that is to try to get the polluter to pay, and to get the government to introduce regulations which are like a carbon tax, for instance, but, just the polluter in agriculture should pay. And then another thing to do is to make sure that you have a system of measuring the impacts of farming where if you diminish your soil carbon, that shows on your balance sheet. So then this sort of false profitability of extractive farming will be exposed. And obviously, all that requires government action. And this finally, I've got to answering your question about, do we have a farm bill? So far, we have failed to convince the European Union, or now after Brexit, the UK government, that they should make the polluter pay in agriculture, or that we should redirect the subsidies in a way which benefits proper regenerative farming at the expense of industrial farming. Now, I say that, although that's not 100% true, because just in the last couple of years, the English government, but also the Welsh, Scottish, and Northern Ireland devolved administrations have had to redesign the subsidy package, which is your equivalent to the Farm Bill, so that farmers are rewarded for delivering what one of our ag secretaries called public goods. And literally, as we speak, these packages are being announced, and we are getting very strong reactions of conventional farmers all over Europe, including in Wales. Literally, it was on the television news the night before last in Wales, that all the farmers who have intensified because the polluter wasn't paying and they weren't responsible for their damage are angry that their subsidies are now going to be removed from them. And the First Minister in Wales basically called them out and said, well, sorry, but we're not going to give public money any longer for farming practices which are bad for climate change and nature and for society. And these farmers are really upset because they've just assumed that this annual check, which they get from the government, which had no conditions attached to it whatsoever, really, similar to your farm bill, I would say, is going to be denied of them. And so it's not perfect what the redesign of the agricultural subsidy package is. And the farmers are revolting, literally revolting,
Yes.
and blocking roads and doing all sorts of stuff. So the government has a really difficult decision to make, because basically if they introduce this redirected subsidy package, the indirect consequence will be that the price of food will go up. The price of bad food will go up. The price of good food may come down. So, sorry, that's a whole circular response to your question, but I think back to your point, what you last said, which is that one response to this situation is not to wait for the government to regulate and to make the polluter pay and to redirect the subsidies and to change the farm bill, but in advance of that, just get on as you are doing with relocalizing the food systems, because that can be slightly more immune to the damage that the wrong government policies are doing.
Yeah, yeah, and I do want to say something about what's happening to the farmers because I do have some compassion for them. And one of the things here is that it takes 3 years to transition from conventional to organic. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we had real programs in place to support the farmers to just pull their subsidies and not give them any support in transitioning is a real, I think, oversight here in our country, and I don't know if it is in the UK and also in the EU. But are they providing any kind of any sort of package to help them make the transition?
Yes, they are, but I think you're making a really important point. You cannot really blame the farmers for following the policy and the money. And I've just written a blog, which is going to probably go out from our website tomorrow, on exactly this subject, saying, you know, an intensive farmer who didn't have a day job like I have, or other advantages, you can't blame them for responding to the policy signals and following the money. And in fact, they're just pawns in the game. They're trapped in this horrible cycle
Yeah.
where the big food buyers are just demanding lower and lower prices, and their only way to survive is to intensify it and to expand their herd numbers. So I feel a lot of sympathy with these farmers who are feeling very angry and criticized. But the truth is, the government is trying to do the right thing. But as you say, we've got to find a way to transition them gently and make sure that it's economically viable for them to go on that journey. And that is in itself is quite a challenge.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, it's a really big issue, and it's hard to take sides for sure because it's so complex. You know
It's really important not to take sides, it seems
Yeah,
to me.
that's
That
right.
we mustn't be angry. And there's polarized fights that are going on and all over the world. I mean, including these dreadful conflicts.
Yeah.
I mean, the solution is not to be angry and to make it worse by, kind of oppositional positions.
Yes, that's right, that's right. 'Cause I
Sure.
wanna talk about your, sustainable food trust, which for our American listeners, a trust is essentially a nonprofit, right? Is that what a trust is in the UK? Okay. Uh,
Yeah. So we're a non-profit. We are a registered UK charity, which is, yeah, your equivalent of a 501c3.
okay.
In fact, we have a 501c3 called the Sustainable Food Alliance. So because in the early days of the Sustainable Food Trust, more than half our income was coming from US donors. So if
Mm.
anybody's watching this, listening to this, thank you very much, because
Yeah.
we our origins go right back to the support of a small number of foundations and individuals who saw the need for our work, because we do work internationally.
Wow.
That's interesting too because, with Brexit, some political thinkers are suggesting that you're going to have to align with the states on a number of issues, right? Trade and defense and all kinds of things. And in many ways, we really are, we're sister countries.
We
And
are.
so supporting each other across the pond, so to speak, each other's work, I think is really important.
I think it's incredibly important. I feel this very strong connectivity between our two countries, and we have cultural roots, and obviously we need to apologize for all our colonial misdemeanors, which we do.
Well, it was a long
but
time ago.
but we love you guys.
Yeah.
We're connected, and let's work at strengthening the connectivity between us, because it's the truth, isn't it? We are connected.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we really are. And it was really important to me to talk to you today because I think a lot of young Americans aren't familiar with how critically important you are to the organic and sustainable food movement. As a matter of fact, King Charles is on record talking about the, sustainability movement could never have made the progress that it has without your really hard work and, what's how did not intensity, but yeah, you're just very, very committed and passionate, and let's see, it's one of the numbers I read, somewhere, Patrick, is that under your while you were director of the Soil Association, and also you founded the Sustainable Food Trust and the U.S. Sustainable Food. During your tenure, during all those years in the 90s and the 2000s and right up through 2010, that somehow the annual sales of organic produce in the UK are rose from like 50 million pounds to 2 billion pounds. I mean, is that right? I mean, that's crazy. That's so
Well,
impressive.
well, I was just, around with maybe 100 other organic growers and farmers. Many of them were actually back to the landers from cities, not all. And the force was with us. But it was an extraordinary time because when I first started working for the Soil Association, which of course was founded by Lady Eve Balfour, uh, who was in turn inspired by a man called Sir Albert Howard. And the organization was formed in 1946, just after the Second World War. But it remained an organization with some really brilliant thinkers who pioneered all the big ideas, I think, that it, uh, lay behind all our movements, including Rodale, and they all worked together back in the day. But when we came along, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, there wasn't really a developed organic market. And we decided that it's partly a survival strategy because we were finding we were having to charge more for our food to stay in business because we wanted to put our principles into practice on the land. So we literally got back to the land and started selling food. And then we found out quite quickly we couldn't make a living out of it without charging a premium. So we had this idea, oh, well, why don't we just define what we mean by organic? That's the standards. And then talk to the consuming public, mostly through the media, tell our story and build a separate market for people who wanted to support more sustainable food in the marketplace. And that quite literally is the story of what we did for maybe 10 or 20 years from the end of the 70s to build the organic market. And I was involved with the Soil Association Organic Standards Committee. And they said to me, well, you're a dairy farmer. Why don't you write the standards for organic dairy farming? So I did. And because we were one of the early adopters in the UK of organic standards, I think I can claim a bit of the DNA of the organic standards in that way. But it was an amazing time. And I think really a lot of what we were doing was just storytelling. So we moved to Bristol, actually, the headquarters of the Soil Association were in the east of England, in the county of Suffolk. But we moved the offices to Bristol, where I am now.
Mm.
And there were only three of us, basically, well, five of us, I think, actually, if you included the sort of part-timers in the office. And the phone used to ring, no emails in those days. And it was journalists who somehow got wind of what we were doing. And they found that we told interesting stories, and they tended to be on the right side of truthful. And so a lot of the work that we did in developing the organic market was just actually kind of, wave riding on media interest and getting our stories out there. And I think it was a very exciting time to be around.
Yeah, and the Prince of Wales, I think also, and now King Charles was, I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize that he was a longtime supporter of organic and sustainable food systems. And when I used to travel back in the early 2000s to London quite a bit, I always made a point of getting his amazing oat shortbread cookies from was it Duchy, something like that was it.
Dutch
Oh
originals.
gosh, they were the best, all organic. And you've been an advisor on his Terra Carta initiative, which in 2021 launched the Terra Carta Sustainability Seal. I mean, can you say just a little bit more about the seal, and how do you think his efforts and commitment to sustainability have influenced consumers and policies in the UK?
Well, I think not just in the UK, he's been a massive influence all over the world. And he started farming organically at the farm near Highgrove, which is the country home he has in Gloucestershire, not far from here actually, in 1985. And the guy who ran his farm for him for 35 years, he was asked at his interview whether he would try some biologically sustainable farming. This was in 85, just after he come to the farm. And he didn't even know what that meant. So he said yes, as you do at interviews. And the farm at Highgrove became a place of pilgrimage for many, many visitors from all over the world. And I think the influence of his leadership in organic farming has been amazing, amazing. And it still goes on. And he's passionate about it. He's deeply committed. He's intuitive. So he has a passion which is born out of his intuition that he needs to do things. And I think he's the most remarkable human being. And the latest manifestation, two things I'd like to say about his work. One is that he launched in 2020 the Sustainable Markets Initiative at Davos at the World Economic Forum. And his idea was this, that he concluded that we would never be able to address climate change and get on the right side of reducing emissions in the time available unless we involve the business community. So he said, I will convene task forces for every sector, from plastics to mining to aviation, you name it, and there's a task force on it, all CEOs. And one of them was a task force measuring land use sustainability, which I'm heading up. So if you said to me 5 years ago, you'll end up being able to meet some of these CEOs from some of the world's biggest companies, I said, well, I would have said that would never happen, but it actually has happened. And as a result of that, we are now working with some of the big companies to finance, on a project called Financing the Agricultural Transition, which is trying to find a new income stream for farmers to reward them for their carbon nature and positive social impacts.
Yes.
That's just one example of what he's doing, what he's done. But another example is a book that hardly anyone has read, which is called Harmony, A New Way of Looking at Our World, which he wrote in 2010. And it's basically his contribution to realizing a new understanding of our relationship with nature based on an idea, but I think the reality of the interconnectedness of everything and the way in which common mathematical and geometric laws inform the whole cosmos and are reflected in nature and even in our own bodies. And that book, Harmony, I think it's in a way sums up his whole life's work, because it brings all his ideas about architecture and the environment and sustainable agriculture together and makes them understandable through a sort of common metric. And so I'm a massive fan of his. I think he's an incredible man, and I'm just hoping that his health will get through this challenge
Yeah.
that he's currently facing.
Yeah. And what about his Terra Carta sustainability seal? What metrics
So
are
the
they using?
So that relates directly to the task force that I'm leading, which is that in order to reward farmers or anyone for moving towards net zero on climate change or for delivering benefits, you need to measure. And the Global Farm Metric Task Force, which is what we hope will be a common global way of measuring land use sustainability, will enable you and I or anyone else, farmers throughout the world, to say, well, how are you doing on a common way of evaluating your impact on your farming system? And it would be like accounting protocols, a common global language. And so the Terra Carta seal and the idea of putting a label on it relates directly to that harmonization of measurement, because obviously you can't manage what you don't measure.
Right.
And in a world where there are a lot of people talking greenwash, they're saying we're doing stuff, but they're using their own measurement system.
Right.
We need to shine the light on that and to make sure that people can navigate all these claims in a common way. So that's just one example of what the Prince, now the King, has done for us all, I think. And I think that he is one of the most important human beings on the planet at the present time, in a world of, corrupt leaders and people who seem to have lost the plot and are fighting these dreadful wars. I mean, he really does stand out as a compassionate human being.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess
to me.
my final question would be about what you're talking about, I guess, related to how do you think technology and AI will help us get closer to accurately measuring, uh, sustainability? And are you hopeful about how that might go in the future?
I honestly don't have any idea. I mean, I feel very optimistic that we if we work together in the way that, we feel this affinity, I feel this accord between us in this conversation. I feel that we just have reached a common understanding of, the world and with the separate but related worlds in which we find ourselves. And if we work together in a sort of microcosm, macrocosm way like that, there's no limit to what we can do because I feel we're coming from a right place, a deeper place, a place of integrity and a place of genuinely trying to work together in our common humanity to make the world a better place for those that follow us. I don't know what role technology or AI will have in all that, but I can't believe that we can't harness it to good effect. And if we work together in a spirit of trust, then we can navigate the obvious hurdles and obstacles and risks that are associated with that kind of technology. I mean, I'd love to know what you think about AI.
Yeah, yeah, I'm optimistic. I mean, I could see it going both ways, and I just, sort of mimic what I hear Bruce talking about. But yeah, I'm optimistic about, for instance, how it could measure soil very, very quickly, tell you within, with a photograph, tell you what's in the soil.
That's a great example of how it could be used positively. Fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and I think, no matter what's happening as we move into technology and out of the industrial era and into the information age, I'm really committed to helping young people navigate this. You and I are not gonna understand AI and all of this other stuff that's coming at us, but hopefully we can be there as support and offer some level of wisdom and history to the young people who are going to take your legacy forward into the world. And thank you for having a big family who can also take your legacy into the world,
Yeah.
and building a beautiful nonprofit. You've got a lot of employees there, and so you really you've walked the talk. You're a living example of what I think people in our age should be aspiring to. I'm just a couple minutes behind you in age, but I take this sort of commitment to young people pretty seriously. And it just is such a pleasure to connect with you. And I hope we can see each other in August and carry the conversation on more. Yeah.
So do I. I mean, let's see each other in August, and if I come over to the Bay Area, I'll beat a path to your door if I may.
Oh, yeah, we actually have an old hippie bus that we're converting into a guest quarters, and we'd love to host you, and I wanna meet
Yep.
Becky, and, so we'll definitely see each other this year and keep this conversation going. It's such a pleasure talking with you, Patrick.
Fabulous. It's mutual, and it's our obligation to work together, isn't it? We must serve the higher places that there's something that's flowing into the world at the moment, I think, and we have to place ourselves where we can be of service to its harmonious evolution. And I think that can happen.
Yes. Yes, I agree. Hear, hear. Okay, well, I guess on that note, thank you so much, and, enjoy your dinner, and and we'll be in
Sure.
touch.
Thank you. Yeah, the same. Thank you so much.